Simon. So, on to introduce Miko. Back in the mid 1970s, I was living in Tel Aviv and working at a English language monthly magazine called New Outlook. I was editing that for a few years, and I was very, very thrilled to have being involved on our editorial board and as a frequent writer, a man named Miko Peled, who is Miko's father, who was Miko's father. He's deceased now. And he was as you'll hear more from him, a general who had become a peace advocate and evolved and was eventually a member of Knesset, the Israeli parliament, for a while. Very impressive guy, and that made me especially, having the memory of having worked with him, made me especially excited to welcome Miko here to Sacramento, whom I just met for the first time today. I heard him speak earlier at City College, and he has a story to tell of his own background, his own evolution as an Israeli, becoming aware of the Palestinian struggle, and hopefully some words about what's going on now and what we can do about it. So please welcome Miko Peled.
But anyway, so it's nice to be here. It's nice to see this bookstore. Like you heard, I come from a very, I should say, very patriotic Israeli Zionist family, which makes my, which is what makes the story, I think, unique and interesting, and which is what led me to actually write the book. Like you heard, my father was a general, and I'll talk about him a little bit more as I go on. Can everybody hear me okay, by the way? Yeah. And then about my own journey of transformation. But before I begin, I always like to start my remarks with a disclaimer. And that disclaimer is that if anybody came here hoping to hear a balanced presentation, then they're going to be sorely disappointed. Because this is not going to be a balanced presentation, and I don't believe that a balanced presentation on this issue is possible at all. Most people that I know either have strong opinions or strong feelings about this issue, one way or the other, and I certainly have very strong feelings and very strong opinions about this issue. It's very personal to me, the issue of Israel and Palestine. And beyond that, it's really not a balanced situation, so you can't really talk about it in balanced terms. People often equate it to two children in the playground that can't get along, and they should be allowed to get along. I equate it more to a bully in the playground running around with a machine gun, shooting in all directions, which definitely requires an adult to step in and do something. So that's clearly not a balanced presentation. The other aspect is, the other thing that I like to say up front is that this is an issue that is so layered in myth, and there's so much double standard about this, that it's sometimes hard to hear what I have to say, because I try to uncover some of the stuff, some of the myth. And I know when I went through the process, being an Israeli and hearing these things that most Israelis don't hear, and certainly most Americans don't hear, it can be very difficult. So like I said, I like to say this up front so that everybody knows what they're getting themselves into, or what they got themselves into by coming today. Talking about double standard, I like to throw out, just to start off, to throw out one example of a double standard. The whole issue of the State of Israel, the whole issue of the creation of the State of Israel and Zionism in general. My grandparents immigrated to Palestine because they were Zionists. My mother's father was, one of the signers of Israel's Declaration of Independence. So this is some serious, patriotic Zionism. But what is Zionism? I mean, what is the whole idea of the State of Israel? The whole idea of the State of Israel was the right of Jewish people to come back to their homeland. Now, these are not the Jewish people that were exiled. These are and it's not really their descendants either. These are people that claim some kind of relation to other people who lived there a couple of thousand years ago. Yet the right of the Jewish people to return has somehow been established as something that's accepted. Let's take a look at the other issue of the right of return. When we talk about the right of return for Palestinians, for example, this is one issue, probably the biggest issue that raises everybody's eyebrows and goes, wait a minute, that we cannot allow. The right of return, that's a red line. We cannot allow that. And you hear this from people, I don't want to say all across the political spectrum, but I would say certainly 75% of the political spectrum. The Palestinian right of return is a red line because that will lead to the destruction of Israel. It becomes what they call a demographic threat. Now the Palestinians, we're talking about the right of the people who are actually exiled in many cases, because many of them are still alive. This was only 65 years ago. And in case they did pass away, we're talking about their children or their children's children. In other words, we're talking about their direct descendants, people who actually know we're here and can prove because they have the deed and the keys to their homes. Yet on this issue, there's almost a consensus that it's an issue that's unacceptable, not even negotiable. But why do we accept the right of return of one nation, but we don't accept the right of return of another nation? And this is just one example of the double standard that exists on this issue. Now, I like to start, when I talk about this issue, I think it's important to go back. There's one of the myths that's out there is that this issue has been going on for centuries and centuries. This conflict has been going on forever, and therefore, there's really no end in sight. It's really not realistic to ever assume that this could be resolved. Well, this conflict began when the United Nations did this. It tried to partition the land, it tried to partition Palestine, and I think everybody here probably knows, Palestine and Israel is the exact same place. Okay? So it began when the United Nations decided to partition Palestine into this. I mean, regardless of the details, you look at this map, I mean, there's nothing there that looks like it's practical or doable. But besides that, at that time, the Jewish community numbered about 500,000 people, the Palestinian community numbered about 1.5 million people. But somehow the United Nations found it made sense to give the smaller portion to the Palestinians, who were the majority, and the larger portion to the Jewish community, which was by far the minority. And then people were surprised that the Palestinians didn't like it. And this claim is still being made today. Well, had the Palestinians accepted the UN resolution, we wouldn't be there today. Why would they expect it? Why would they accept it? And how could anybody expect that they would accept it? Of course, for the Jews, for the Zionists, I don't say the Jews because that includes Jews. That's a far broader term. I want to talk about the Zionists. For the Zionists, this was a huge accomplishment. Their effort to be recognized as a state and to recognize the Jewish people or the Jews as a nation was accomplished. And this was a huge diplomatic victory for them. Not only were they recognized, but they got the majority. They got the bigger half of the land, the bigger portion of the land. Now, the story that we hear is that, of course, the Zionists were jubilant, but the Arabs were angry, and they decided to destroy the Jewish community, and they attacked from all directions, intending on throwing the Jews into the ocean and destroying the small Jewish community. And this is only just a few years after the Holocaust. In other words, another Holocaust. And somehow, maybe miraculously, the smaller Jewish community was able to not only prevail, but conquer the majority, conquer even more land. And the state was established, and the Israeli army was established, and here we were. But let's take a look at what happened between the end of 1947, when the UN resolution was accepted, and the end of 1948, when the war ended. The Zionist forces, of which my father was a young officer, managed to conquer about 80% of the country. They destroyed over 500 towns and villages. And they exiled almost 1 million people in 12 months. And they did this when they were being attacked from the outside, or they were being attacked by the Arabs. Now let's take a look at the Arabs. Now in Zionist lingo, there's no such thing as Palestinians, there's Arabs. And these are the Arabs of Israel. When we look at the two communities, they were living on parallel lines. They were both states in the making. But one aspect, or one thing that the Jewish community developed that the Palestinians did not, was a militia, was a fighting force. At that time, the Haganah and some of the other militias numbered about 40,000 fighting men and some women, and they were all armed. Palestinians did not have an equivalent. They never did. There was no equivalent on the Palestinian side. So the myth that somehow the Palestinians began attacking and destroying with intent to is complete. It just doesn't make any sense, because there was no Palestinian fighting force. So as we look at it, and again we take a look at these 12 months, what we actually see, or what we can actually realize, is that as soon as this resolution was accepted, as soon as the Zionist community received that recognition, they began a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing in an effort to get rid of as many people as possible, to claim as much of the land as possible, and to change completely the Arab nature of the country into something different and new, something that suited the Zionist mission. And that is where this begins. Now, what I do in the book, and what I'm going to do tonight, is show you how, just to demonstrate how my own family's personal experience kind of weave into the national experience, the experience of the two nations and the experience of this country. This is my mother when she was young. She was 22 years old. She's 86 now. She still lives in Jerusalem. She was born and raised in Jerusalem. And she used to tell me how when she was a child, she would like on a weekend, on a Saturday afternoon, she would walk around the Arab neighborhoods. And we're not talking about the old city, we're talking about West Jerusalem. The Arab neighborhoods, she would see the families sitting in the front yard by the lemon tree, and the children playing and so on and so forth. And it was a real pleasant experience for her. When she was 22 years old, that was already 1948, the Palestinian neighborhoods of West Jerusalem were taken by the Haganah, and the Palestinian residents were forced to leave, as were hundreds of thousands, all over the country. But their homes were left standing. And these are beautiful homes. They still exist in Jerusalem. If you walk around Jerusalem, these homes are still there. They're very distinct. They're beautiful, large homes with big gardens and arches and so on. They're beautiful homes. Well, these homes were made available to the families, to Jewish families. And she was offered one of these homes. She had 2 young children. Her husband was fighting in the front, fighting for the Zionist cause. I mean, her husband, my father. And she was offered one of these homes. And I can't recall when she told me the story for the first time, but I recall hearing the story many, many times as I grew up. And her reaction was, how can I possibly take the home of another mother? How can I move into the home of another family that has just been forced into exile? And she would say, can you imagine how much they must miss their home? These beautiful homes and the lemon tree and so on. So she refused. And she stayed living in a small apartment with her mother, which was, believe me, no picnic. just for that, I would have, given her a gold medal. But the point is that I remember hearing the story on the one hand, and hearing and studying and learning the national narrative on the other hand, and I felt that something was wrong, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And it was only much later, when I was actually working on the book, and I spoke to her again and again and again, and heard the story many times, that I realized her story contradicts the national narrative. Because the national narrative says the Arab left. The Arabs left. Well, if they left and they attacked us to begin with and we won, what's the problem? Why not take their homes? As many people did. There are many cities and many neighborhoods around the country that people live or have businesses in Arab homes that are still intact, Palestinian homes that are still intact. So what was wrong here? And I couldn't quite figure it out, like I said, until many years later, that there was a contradiction here. What she was expressing was actually validating what Palestinians have been saying for decades. That there's another story here, and that the narrative that we learn in Israel and the narrative that people learn here in America is actually a myth. Now, I'm going to jump forward 20 years, and this is my father as a general. And the book is titled The General's Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, which are the 2 parts of my life. And like I said, my father was an officer in 1948. Then when the state was created, the Haganah became the army, the Israeli army. He remained as an officer. had an illustrious career as an officer, and then by 1967 he was already a general for several years. And the drums of war were beating again. And a lot has been written, a lot has been said, many documentaries have been made about that period that led to the 1967 Six-Day War. Who attacked who, what happened, and so on. So what I wanted to do, or what I ended up doing is, when I was working on the book, is to go to the Israeli Army archives. For one reason, I just wanted to learn as much as possible about his career. But I also wanted to read. I learned that the minutes of the meetings of the generals leading up to the war were available, and I wanted to read them. Now, I wasn't expecting to find anything new, because a lot has already been written about this. Many historians have gone in, read those minutes, and wrote about it. Well, as I'm reading this, and it's all very exciting, you see, my father's name and the other generals, and these are all people that I knew as a child, and so on. It's all very exciting. But I saw something that I had never seen or heard before. Never. My father said this, and then the other generals were saying this, that the Egyptian army was not prepared for war, and therefore this was a good time to attack. Now, if you recall, in the spring of 1967, President Nasser kicked out the UN peacekeepers from the Sinai Peninsula and entered his troops into the Sinai Peninsula and threatened to close the Straits of Tiran, which would not allow Israeli ships to go up to Eilat. Well, the generals were saying, we have an opportunity, and they were pushing for war. But not only were they pushing for war, they were pushing for war knowing that they were going to be victorious. They say this over and over again in their own internal discussions and in their discussions with the cabinet. That the Egyptian army needs at least a year and a half to 2 years in order to be prepared for war. The fact that the Egyptian army is now closer to Israel makes it easier for us to destroy them. And therefore we need to attack now. Now the cabinet was hesitant. These are two very different groups of Jewish people. Represented two different generations, but also two different philosophies. The cabinet was made of gentlemen, mostly gentlemen, who were in their mid to late 60s. They were almost all of them, all but one, were immigrants from Eastern Europe. They had suffered the pogroms, and they saw what Christian Europe did to Jewish people. And mind you, this was 25 years only after the Holocaust. They were carrying all of this. My father's generation, these generals that made up the IDF top brass, were in their early to mid-40s. Most of them were born in Palestine. Almost all of them were members of the Palmach, the Haganah, the Jewish militia. They were this new creation, this new testosterone-filled Jew that was there to deliver the land of Israel to the Jewish people. They did most of the work in 1948. And now they saw an opportunity to finish the job by taking more land. So this contest between these two groups went on for some time. Eventually, the army won the day, which is typical in Israel, in the Israeli politics. The more militants, the army always wins the day. And they did, and the war began. Now, what is the story about 1967? We hear the president, the candidates for president talk about this too. Israel was once again attacked by Arab armies intending to destroy the Jewish nation. 25 years after the Holocaust, another Holocaust was impending. There was an existential threat. We hear this again, by the way, about all this nonsense with Iran. An existential threat. Ehud Barak was saying the other day that the threat from Iran is even worse than the existential threat that existed in 1967. He didn't read my book, and he didn't read the minutes of the meetings of the generals prior to 1967. There was no threat at all. Not to say there wasn't an existential threat. There was no threat at all. There was an opportunity for another military victory. So they began the war. The cabinet approved the preemptive strike against Egypt. Preemptive strike against Egypt. That's what the cabinet approved. That went on very easy. Within days, the Egyptian army was completely destroyed. The Sinai Peninsula was taken. The Gaza Strip was taken. Now, the generals who were the commanders of the Central and the Northern Front wanted a piece of this too. And for these generals who were young officers in 1948, the fact that the West Bank was not a part of Israel was a very sore spot. This was a very sore. They knew that militarily Israel was capable of taking it in 1948, and for political reasons they chose not to. And they wanted to get the job done. They wanted to finish the job because they thought the eastern boundary of the state of Israel needs to be the Jordan River. And that's why we need the West Bank. So they took the West Bank. And they wanted the Golan Heights because it was, strategic, it was very high, the hills and so on, and there was a lot of water there too, so they wanted to take the Golan Heights. So they took that as well. Now, if the Egyptian army wasn't prepared for war, it was the best of all the other Arab armies. Certainly the Jordanian and the Syrian army were not prepared for war. So that went very smoothly. Now, the myth is that everybody attacked Israel. Yet somehow, in 6 days, Israel managed to conquer the West Bank, the Golan Heights, the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip. They managed to kill upwards of 15,000 Arab soldiers at a cost of 700 soldiers, 700 Israeli soldiers. That's quite a ratio. And they did all this in 6 days. Somehow, miraculously again. Somehow this image of David and Goliath came up again, as it did in 48, and David won again. But when we look again at the facts, when we look at the step-by-step, when we look at what the generals were saying, we see that this is a myth. There was no David and Goliath. There was an attempt by Israel to conquer more land, and that's why the war began. I have a picture here that demonstrates. These are all the generals right after the war, with Zalman Shazar, who was the president of the State of Israel, in the center. And you can see the two generations. I mean, he represents the cabinet, the generation of the people who, these generals' parents, and also the Israeli cabinet, who was made up of people of that generation, and then all these young, testosterone-filled, victorious generals who were termed later on the silver platter upon which the land of Israel was given back to the Jews. And for the first time after 2,000 years in exile, the entire land of Israel was in Jewish hands. Historically, from a Jewish perspective, this is unbelievable. But an interesting thing happened. At the very first meeting of the generals, right after the war, my father stood up and said this: now that we've won this war, we have an opportunity to solve the Palestinian problem. We have another nation here that we still have to deal with. We can allow them to establish a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza and solve this problem. And this will be our bridge to peace with the other Arab countries. We will help them create their own Arab Palestinian state in Palestine, and they will be the first Arab state to make peace with Israel. This could be an enormous opportunity for us. The other generals looked at him like he had lost his mind. And in the end, finally, after he kept persisting, Rabin, who was chief of staff, took him aside and said, look, this is not the right climate to talk about giving back land. And at the same time, a massive, massive effort to build settlements in East Jerusalem and the West Bank began immediately, so as to make that conquest irreversible. Just as Israel did after 1948, building cities and towns and highways for Israelis only on Palestinian land, the same thing happened in the West Bank. They began building cities and towns and highways in East Jerusalem, expanding East Jerusalem, and in the West Bank for Israelis on Palestinian land, and expelling Palestinians. It was the exact same process, and with the same intention, to keep the land, to keep the conquests. Now, when my father retired, he kept talking. He retired a year later, and he kept talking, and he dedicated the whole other, more than half, but the rest of his life, to advocating for two things: a Palestinian state in the West Bank for the Palestinians who live in the West Bank and Gaza, and equal rights for the Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, who never had and still don't have equal rights in Israel. So this is in essence what took place. Palestine was replaced by Israel. And the effort to do this began in 1947, 48, and is still going on today. It's more than just ethnic cleansing. It's more than just kicking out the people. It's destroying their homes and then de-Arabizing the land. This country that was under Arab and Muslim rule for 1,500 years has many monuments. It is an Arab country. And all of that has to be destroyed so as to make the connection between the state of Israel, the Zionist state, and the biblical kingdom of Israel from the days of King David and so on. This is the attempt. And if you look at different places around the country, you see it happening day by day. People being kicked out of their homes, homes being destroyed, names being changed, and this new history being created that connects today's Israel with biblical kingdom of Israel. And one place that I always like to mention is Silwan. Silwan is just outside the old city of Jerusalem. So if you've been there and if you've seen, for example, the Jewish Quarter and the Wailing Wall, as you come out the gate, right on the bottom, at the bottom of the hill, this valley is called Silwan, and there are 50,000 people that live there. It's a Palestinian community of 50,000 people. I live in a town that has 25,000 people. I can't imagine anybody coming and destroying it for some reason, okay? Someone decided that the ancient city of David exists in Silwan under the homes of those Palestinians. So their homes are being destroyed, they are being expelled, settlers are moving in, they have their own militia that guards them and shoots Palestinians without distinction. And a new park, an archaeological park is being built, the city of David. And they have these beautiful posters of Jewish kids playing in the grounds and walking among the ruins and picking up little coins from the days of King David, creating this entire mythology. Never mind the fact that there is no historical evidence that King David ever existed. But 50,000 people have to be thrown out of their homes. The entire community has to be destroyed. This is the process. This is the hallmark of the Zionist state. Taking the land, kicking out the people, and de-Arabizing the country. De-Arabizing it from its history and from its culture. What's interesting is this. This is my father later on in the mid-1970s. His efforts as, you know, to push forward this agenda, this issue of the two-state solution, was recognized by the PLO as a worthwhile effort. And Yasser Arafat sent his top people to meet with my dad and others, Rav Neri and others, who some of you may know, to begin a dialogue. And it was a dialogue where official representatives, official Palestinian representatives, officials of the PLO, high-ranking people, were meeting with people, with this group, these Israelis who used to hold high positions and now were really renegades. And they discussed this, and that is how the two-state solution really came into being. The notion that the Palestinians agreed to have a state in the West Bank and Gaza in return for peace. But it wasn't until 1993 that any Israeli government was willing to sit and talk to the PLO. 1993. Now, when they would come back from their meetings, my dad, when this started, Yitzhak Rabin was prime minister. You know, he's prime minister twice. This was his first term. He would go back and report to him every single time. But he had no. And when we look at this notion of the two-state solution that they were discussing, it brings to light the fact how absurd it is to say that the Palestinians were not willing to make concessions. How absurd it was when they said Yasser Arafat was not willing to make concessions. Yasser Arafat pushed the two-state solution. By doing so, he made the biggest concession anybody could even imagine. He gave up 80%, almost 80% of Palestine, of historic Palestine. He gave up the right of the Palestinians who were thrown out to come back or be compensated. If this is not a massive concession, I don't know what is. And this was what was being pushed by him and represented by his top people. This is Issam Sartawi, who was the PLO representative in Paris, ambassador in Paris. And he and my father became good friends too, but that was how the dialogue began. And I talk about this in the book a lot, that sense, that first time that my father was sitting there waiting for the Palestinians to come in, waiting for the enemy to come in, and they were going to embark on this new path. It was a peaceful path. It was a very moving thing that my father wrote, and I brought it in, I put it in the book. But why did it wait? Why did they three? How come no Israeli government was willing to talk to the Palestinians until 1993? They wanted to make sure that the conquest of the West Bank was irreversible, that there was absolutely no way that a Palestinian state could ever be established. And only when they knew for sure that a Palestinian state could not be established in the West Bank did they agree to talk. And they figured it would be convenient for them, for Israel, to have Arafat and some of his cronies governing a few cities, governing a few towns, with very limited autonomy so they would take care of any resistance that would come up. My father died in March. He passed away, he had cancer, he died in March of 1995. This was the height of Oslo process. Everybody was sure that peace was around the corner. Rabin in Paris and Arafat won the Nobel Peace Prize. I think Arafat deserved it. I don't think Rabin in Paris deserved it. And my dad had this, there was a big interview with my father when it was discovered that he was ill, and it was published in the weekend paper. And on the cover it said, Miko Peled says Rabin does not want peace. 1995, Rabin was the man of peace. Everybody thought he lost his mind even more. He read the Oslo Accords. He says Rabin does not want peace. The Oslo Accords cannot possibly lead to peace. And the very last article that he ever wrote was called Requiem to Oslo. And he describes how the Oslo Accord has ruined the chances for peace because of Israel. But it wasn't until they're absolutely certain that it wouldn't be possible to delineate the West Bank or East Jerusalem and actually create a Palestinian state that they agreed to talk to the Palestinians. And this is the reality today, and that's why today when people talk about a two-state solution, in my opinion, they're either blind or they're misled or they're fooling somebody. Because there is no more place for a Palestinian state. So going once again to a more personal aspect of the story, in September of 1997, Smadar, my sister's little girl, who was 13 years old, was killed by suicide bombers in Jerusalem. Now, how do you even write about this? How do you talk about this? A tragedy of such proportions that really no words will ever do it justice. But this was big news. I was living in San Diego already at the time, and I took the first flight out. By the time I arrived, the morning paper had, the front page of the morning paper said, the granddaughter of General Miko Peled killed by Palestinians. And it was not only a tragedy of immense proportions, it was news of immense proportions, because not only was he a general, but he was also Mr. Peace of Palestine. And kind of the message behind it was, well, he believed in peace with Palestinians, now look what they did to him. Didn't do him any good. So my sister's apartment in Jerusalem was packed with mourners, of course, and people who came to express their sorrow, Israelis, Palestinians, everybody, but also hordes and hordes of reporters. And how do you wrap your head around something like this? I mean, you need something, you need an inspiration, you need something to allow you to go back to work and kind of figure out how you're going to continue the rest of your life. And my sister came out finally out of her room, and she faced the people that were there, she faced the reporters, and she was asked about retaliation and about revenge. And the first thing that came out of her mouth was this. She said, no real mother would want to see this happen to any other mother. Don't talk to me about retaliation, about revenge. Motherhood is something that cuts through any differences that there might exist between us. Cuts through race, cuts through religion. No mother would ever want to see another mother go through this. And when she was asked who she thinks is responsible, she pointed her finger at the Israeli government, who was led in those days by Bibi Netanyahu. And she said, these two young men who blew themselves up were willing to take their own lives and kill innocent civilians. The despair that brought them to do this is a result of the brutal occupation, of the brutal regime under which we placed the Palestinians. And if we continue this brutal occupation, and if we continue the brutal oppression of the Palestinians, this is what will happen. This is what's to be expected. She said, my daughter was forsaken by her own government, by her own people, so that settlers could live in the West Bank. Well, this became even more bigger news, and she became quite a celebrity, and she's been very active, and her husband, Rami, too. They've both been very outspoken and very active in efforts to bring out this truth, and also efforts for reconciliation. Now, I went back to the States, where I lived, and have a family and a business, and what do you do? I mean, you go back to work? I mean, what do you do? But her statements kind of put me on a path. And as soon as I got back, I figured I had to do something. I wasn't an activist or anything like that beforehand. And lucky for me, I found the Jewish-Palestinian dialogue group in San Diego. And I went, and this was the first time I ever met Palestinians. Now, I was born and raised in Jerusalem. It's a mixed city. As we hear, it's a united city, it's an eternal city, and all these different things. But the reality is that it's a completely segregated city. So as an Israeli, I never met Palestinians. The first time I met Palestinians, sat with Palestinians in a home, like in the normal setting, and I was completely equal to them. There were no restrictions on their travel. They didn't need any permit. They didn't have to get back by a certain time because of curfew. There were no checkpoints along the way that they had to cross. They were free as I was. And we were all there because we wanted to be there. That was the first time I was in that kind of situation. And over a period of time, I went through this transformation, which is, it's kind of like discovering that you have a parent who's a drug addict or an alcoholic. It's immensely painful, especially coming with all this patriotic Zionist heritage that I came from. But they were very kind and very gentle, and they led me through this in a very nurturing way, which I think is typical of Palestinians. That's been my experience. If you're going to go through this kind of a painful process, it's good to have Palestinians around you. And it was, because it was dialogue, it wasn't nobody was accusing anybody, but everybody was telling their story. Now, I'm an Israeli, and I know that Israelis don't rape, they don't massacre, they don't forcibly exile people. We're moral people, and we're in a moral army. Yes, we made some mistakes. And here were these people that I learned to like and trust were telling me about exactly these things. About mass expulsions, about massacres, about torture, about arrests, about things that I had no idea were going on. Because we don't do this. We, the Israelis. Well, it turns out that they do, that we do. At one point, I remember I was so confused, I called my brother. My older brother teaches political science in Tel Aviv. And I called him up and I said, look, I'm sitting here with these Palestinians and they're making all these claims. Does any of it have any merit? And he said, well, actually it does. And go pick up a book by Ilan Papin, by Avi Shlaim. These are Israeli historians that had just rewritten the history. And what's interesting is that Palestinians have been saying and writing this for decades, but it wasn't until Israelis wrote it that we gave it any kind of credit. So I did, and I learned that this was that there was a new reality. And then I began traveling more and more to the Palestine part of the land. So every time I would go, I traveled either Palestinian communities within Israel or Palestinian or into the West Bank. And as I was traveling into the West Bank, I would come across this sign. Now, as you go through the checkpoints, this one is Kalandia, but as you go through the different checkpoints, you always see the sign. And notice it's in Hebrew. And it's massive. And it's white letters on red, which means danger. And what it reads is this. It says that this road leads to Area A. And Area A is governed by the Palestinian Authority. And then in larger letter it says that entry for Israelis into Area A is forbidden. It is life-threatening, and it is a felony. 2 exclamation marks. Not one, but 2 exclamation marks. So if you weren't frightened by the color or by the fact that it's life-threatening and it's a felony, the 2 exclamation marks will make sure that you pay attention. Now notice this is only true if you speak Hebrew, because it's only in Hebrew. Well, if you have any sense and you see a sign like this, you turn around, you go home. Who in the right mind would go through a sign like this to the other side? And my good fortune was that I did not have the sense to go back, and I kept going. And I know others that have. And what I found, and what I keep finding as I go past the sign every single time, is very interesting. I see traffic jams, and I see kids going to school, and I see shops, and I see people going down the streets, and that's it. I've yet to see anybody with a machine gun want to kill me. I've yet to see the Palestinians who even care that I'm there as an Israeli or not. I've yet to see anybody, waiting for me with a knife to slaughter me. None of that. I've never found that. I still haven't seen that. And neither have any of the other Israelis that I know that have done this. Because it's not there. And over the years, it finally dawned on me, this sign and the wall and the armed Israeli soldiers that divide between us, and the massive humiliation that Palestinians go through every time they go through Tel Aviv airport, hours and hours of horrific humiliation, just to go overseas, they do this on the way out, have nothing to do with security. They have everything to do with racism, and they have everything to do with the desire to keep us apart. They don't want me to go see people over there. And they certainly don't want the people over there to come and see me so that we can talk to each other. As long as I stay on this side and I see the signs and I see the wall, there will be fear. Because most Israelis are afraid and most Israelis won't cross. And the sad thing is that most Israelis see what happens, for example, at Ben Gurion Airport when Palestinians leave and do nothing. And I don't know if you've had that experience. They do this to activists as well, but the process of humiliation and interrogation of Palestinians. Now, the only Palestinians allowed out of Ben Gurion Airport are Israeli citizens. Okay, the Palestinians from the West Bank have to go through Jordan. It is a process that is so humiliating. And for what? For nothing. These are people that are perfectly, the citizens who are going overseas and coming back, or sometimes they live here and they went to visit and they come back. And this is, it's so tragic. But when you see the big picture, you see how it fits in beautifully. The entire security apparatus has been drafted into this racist regime in an effort to destroy the lives of Palestinians. So let's talk a little bit about Palestinian resistance. And I think this is a great quote. I'm going to have to look here to read it. Okay? It's a United Nations resolution from 1973. And it says that the struggles of people under colonial and alien domination and racist regimes, all three of which characterize the state of Israel, by the way, for the implementation of their right to self-determination and independence is legitimate and in full accordance with the principles of international law. So Palestinian resistance is legitimate and it is in full accordance with international law. Now, what do we know, or what do we hear in Israel, what do we hear in the West about Palestinian resistance? Palestinian resistance means suicide bombers and terrorists. The reality is that the vast majority of Palestinian resistance over 65 years has been nonviolent. The vast majority of Palestinian resistance has been nonviolent. If we look at the thousands and thousands of Palestinians who are held in Israeli prisons and have been held over the 65 years, we're talking about thousands and thousands of prisoners that are held in Israel, by the way, in violation of international law. Less than 10% are in prison for violent crimes. Less than 10% are in prison for violent crimes. The vast majority are political prisoners. The vast majority of Palestinian resistance was nonviolent, and it still is, and this is by principle. This is not by chance. This is by principle. Now, in this picture, I'm standing with a friend of mine, Jamal Mansour, who sat in prison for many, many years. He was given a life term, but he was exchanged in one of the prisoner exchanges between Israel and the PLO. And he and two others snuck up behind two Israeli soldiers who were guarding a bank in Ramallah and stabbed them to death. So he's what's called, he's got blood on his hands. That's what they call it in Israel. So there are many, many restrictions on his life. But anyway, he's not in prison at least. And we became very, very good friends. But what he did, according to this, is in full accordance with international law and is completely legitimate. Now, what did I do? I served in the Israeli army for 3 years. Not only that, but I volunteered to serve in a combat unit. The Israeli army, with people like me serving it, forced people like him to resist, because we were the ones who actually maintained the occupation and the brutal oppression of these people. We allowed the state to take their land, and we kept them from resisting. Who's the terrorist between the two of us? Just because I had a uniform and a state behind me doesn't mean that I was not the terrorist. And I'd venture to say that the Israeli army is, in fact, probably the most well-equipped, or one of the most well-equipped at least, well-trained and well-fed terrorist organizations in the world. Yes, they wear a uniform. Yes, they have generals and they have ranks and they have all these different things. But they are, in fact, a terrorist organization. Now the book ends, and I think it's appropriate to end this talk tonight with, well, how do we go from here? How do two nations share a land? How do we do this? There are a lot of examples of states that are multinational states. Belgium, Switzerland, many others. How do we bring these two, what's the solution for these two nations so that they can share the land in peace? Israel has in fact created one state. People talk about, well, it's one state or two states. Israel created one state between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. It created, it established it so that none of the conquests that were made by Israel over 65 years could ever be reversed. When you hear Netanyahu talk, he says, you know, there is no difference between Ma'ale Adumim and Tel Aviv. Ma'ale Adumim is a city in the West Bank. There is no difference between Halamish, which is a settlement in the West Bank, and Haifa. Israeli politicians say this all the time. I had a young Israeli officer say this to me. I was on my way to a protest in the West Bank, and he was manning a roadblock and wouldn't let me in, and we got into this conversation. And he said, what are you doing here? I said, what are you doing here? And he said, well, this is no different than Tel Aviv. There's a Jewish city here. Israelis believe there is no difference anymore between the West Bank and the rest of Israel because there is no difference anymore. It is all one state. The ridiculous thing that this officer said to me, and you hear this a lot, he said, why do you want to go there anywhere? It's a war zone, like there's a war going on. I said, excuse me, where's the other army? I see you guys all dressed, like Rambo, but where's the other army? You mean those kids with the rocks? You call this war? You've got some growing up to do, kid. World War II was a war. This is not war. This is oppression, and you are the oppressor. Wake up, you're no hero. But this is what Israelis believe. This is what Israeli soldiers think. They think that there's a war going on and that they're somehow saving their side, completely disregarding the fact that there is no army. There has never been a military on the Palestinian side. Now Israel does this in a very sophisticated way because it's a racist state. It's a brutal regime, but it manages to put a face, a very smiling face onto it. A very democratic face. And the way they do it is very sophisticated. Everybody between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea is governed by the state of Israel. Everyone. The Palestinian Authority has less authority than a city council. Even though they have the head of the Palestinian Authority is called the president, which is quite ridiculous. But it has less authority than a city council. So everybody's governed by the state of Israel, but different groups are governed under different laws, which is why often people call it an apartheid state. Jimmy Carter was the first one to bring the apartheid word out of the box. Good for him. There are the laws that govern the lives of people like myself, Israeli Jews. It's a complete democracy. It's free. I can say what I want. I can go where I want. I can come when I want to. I can leave when I want to. There are no restrictions. Literally, there are no restrictions. Then there are the laws that govern the lives of Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, who lived in Israel, it's not inside the West Bank, but in Israel, what people like to call Israel proper. And the claim that's being made about this is really funny. You hear people say, well, look at the Palestinians in Israel. They're the only people, they're only Arabs in the world that have democracy. And they have it so good, they don't even want to leave. And yes, they have beautiful houses. The Palestinian communities within Israel are so neglected. In some cases, they're in worse shape than Gaza. You'd be hard-pressed to see a house, a school, a road, anything that was built by the state for these communities in the last 65 years. Not a single permit was given to these communities to build a house. There are over 30 laws in the Israeli law books, over 30 laws in the law books that discriminate specifically against the Palestinians who are Israeli citizens. When they go through, and I'm talking about this Tel Aviv thing again, the airport again, when they go through Tel Aviv airport, they go through hours and hours of hell, of humiliation, and a search that you would think they were all murder suspects, at least murder suspects. And there's an entire culture of racism and segregation and discrimination against them. A simple example is a Palestinian couple who lives in Israel, Israeli citizens, cannot get a mortgage. It's not a law, it's just the reality. Can you imagine a young couple gets married, they want to build a house, they want to buy a house, they cannot get a mortgage because they are Palestinians. Again, it's not by law, it's just by the reality, it's just the way it is. No bank will give them a mortgage. So that's the second set of laws. The third set of laws are the laws that govern the lives of Palestinians who live in the West Bank and Gaza. And there is no law that protects them. These laws are determined by the security forces. And they can be killed, they can be arrested, they can be tortured, their homes can be destroyed, they can be kicked out at will. And there is no law that protects them. We're talking about 1.5 million people in Gaza and 2.5, 3 million people in the West Bank. There is no law in the world that protects them. You can take away their water, you can take away their land, you can throw them in prison, you can beat up and torture their children, you can shoot them, and there are no consequences. And this is how Israel governs this place. So if you come to Israel, what do you see? Because it's so segregated, you see the lives of the Israeli Jews. You see Tel Aviv, you see Jerusalem, yeah, you see soldiers here and there, you see there's a wall, it's not perfect, but hey, it's a democracy, it's great, everybody's free, there's press, there's everything. Palestinians can even vote, which is true, the Palestinian citizens can vote, but their vote has absolutely zero influence on Israeli politics. Because their relation to the rest of the vote is known in advance, the people they vote for have zero influence on Israeli politics. So they sit in the Knesset and they talk, but they don't participate in anything. Certainly not anything that has to do with security, anything that has to do with foreign policy. I think they had an actually cabinet minister, he was a minister for sport or something like that, and culture, but he could never sit in on anything that has to do with security. So they have this toy representation. But it's one state. Now, I think one thing that it's really hard for people to hear, and it's very important for people to hear, I think, and understand. There can never be, and there will never be, a Zionist government that will allow the Palestinians to establish a state on the land of Israel. Ever. Ever. The most liberal-leaning, peaceful, peace-leaning Israeli government, if we take a look at what they were willing to negotiate, does not include East Jerusalem, does not include the major settlement blocks. Now, right there is about, 25% of the West Bank, and does not include the Jordan River Valley, which is about a third of the West Bank. Now, we're talking about a third and another 25% of the West Bank, not of the entire Palestine, which Palestinians have already given up in order to make peace. In the year 2000, when President Clinton took Ehud Barak and Arafat to Camp David, he didn't take them there to come out with a peace agreement. He took them there to come out with the Palestinians on their knees, to come out with a surrender agreement, which Arafat was not willing to sign. And Bill Clinton came up and said, well, Arafat gave some, but Barak gave more. Yasser Arafat gave up almost 80% of Palestine. And then, of course, as we know, Arafat died with Israeli tanks surrounding him in 2004. So we have this myth that somehow the Palestinians aren't willing to negotiate, they're not willing to make concessions, they're the problem, they're the terrorists, and Bibi Netanyahu sits there with his face all sour and saying, we believe in the two-state solution, we believe in peace, but we cannot go to the 67 borders. Zionism and giving up the land are two things that will never go together. They contradict each other. That's why a two-state solution never happened and never will happen. Partition of the land is impossible. So where do we go? It's already one state. The transformation of states that have evil regimes, like apartheid, for example, into democracies has happened before. This is not unique. This is not new. And that's exactly what needs to happen. Peace activists and people who care need to hold the standard that says transformation from a Zionist state to a democracy with equal rights for everybody. That has to be the name of the game. That is the only other option. The Zionist state will never be a partner to peace because it is in contradiction to peace. It's a zero-sum game. And they've proved it over 65 years. If anybody had any doubt, look at the last 65 years. The only way to do this is to bring down the Zionist regime and replace it with a real democracy, the same way that apartheid was removed in South Africa and a real democracy took its place. And there are other examples of fascist regimes that were replaced by democracies around the world. Now, often when Jewish audiences hear this, they say, well, you're talking about another genocide. You're talking about another Holocaust. Nobody's talking about killing anybody. Nobody's talking about a Holocaust. Nobody's talking about genocide. This does not have to be bloody. Transfer of power does not have to be bloody. Certainly this is an uphill battle. Certainly the state of Israel is not going to roll over and die one day and the Israeli army say, okay, we're going to be good. That's never going to happen. That didn't happen in South Africa either. But there are ways in which this type of regime can be removed peacefully and a democracy take its place. And when we look at Israelis and Palestinians and the similarities, the vast similarities between Israelis and Palestinians, we can see that these two people can create an incredible state. They can create an incredible future. There's every reason for hope if we allow them to live together and share the state. But we have to do this. People always say, well, is there hope? Is there hope? Of course there's hope. Of course there's hope. We have two societies that are ready to live together, although maybe they don't know yet, but they're certainly ready to live together, capable of living together because they're very similar. And they can create not only a better future, but they can create a wonderful future for both Israelis and Palestinians in this country. But we really have to help them, and that has to be the name of the game. All right, thank you all very much.
Wow.
Some time for your comments and questions. We'll try to keep them fairly short. Do you want to ask questions or comments? Abby in the back first.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the talk.
Speak loudly so everybody can hear.
Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm on the board of Jewish Voice for Peace, and as of this point, we have eschewed going to our government to try to work on this issue because we find time and time again that our elected officials are not sympathetic. We just found this here in Sacramento with the city council, which, by the way, who wants to buy Jay Schneer a copy of the book? So we've been going to outside methods like supporting boycott and doing education. What do you think we can do here, and how far do you think we can go without actually going to our government directly?
So what should you, meaning JVP?
JVP and activists in the U.S. in general.
Okay. He's making a note of that question. I saw a couple other hands before. Okay, Lori, go ahead.
I also want to thank you so much.
Speak loudly.
I also want to thank you so much, you and your family, for being brave and trying to explain this story that is kept from so many of us, especially from the Jewish community. And, you know, I think the government of the United States thrives on conflict. And so, if the people of, there are Jewish people in Israel and Palestinian, people in Israel, Palestine, who do want to stop the war and have peace and really make it happen, how do you think our government, as it is controlled now with 1% interest, would take that?
So, one more.
What would it take for Israelis to begin to see the advantage? And by that I mean Israelis in power as well as ordinary Israelis.
What would it take for Israelis to see the advantage in peace?
In peace, in real peace.
Okay, let me answer these and then we'll do another round, okay? The first question was, what should activists do here in the States? Well, there are a lot of things that can be done. You mentioned BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Support it. And when we talk about BDS, especially the boycott, people talk about, well, products from the West Bank or products from not the West Bank, products from settlements. Let me tell you something. There's no way you can find out if a product was made in the West Bank or not. Products all over Israel are made in the West Bank, and there's really no way to know. And it makes no difference, because all of Israel is occupied Palestine. All Israeli cities are settlements. There's no difference if they're in the West Bank or in the Galilee. This is all the same state. This is all the same policy. It all has to be boycotted. The boycott has to be over everything. The BDS has to include everything that has to do with Israel. That state has to be boycotted. That state has to understand that what it is doing will not be tolerated. And the BDS is wonderful, and they're making some good strides. People, criticize them from time to time, and no organization, no resistance is ever perfect. But it's very, very important, and it hurts Israelis. Israelis want to be liked. It really hurts their feelings when they're being boycotted. And a lot of times the BDS accomplishments are symbolic. The Israeli Symphony was in London, and they have this concert once a year, and it's always broadcast by the BBC. The BBC wouldn't broadcast. People were standing up with signs. This is new, And Israelis are beginning to learn that there's a price that they have to pay. Israeli generals are afraid to travel to Europe because they might be arrested. So there's all this negotiation, changing laws in Europe and so forth, but it's there. And when Israeli generals come here to Harvard and to Yale and to all these places on sabbaticals, and because they're all these, they're military experts and they're strategic experts and so on, they should be afraid to come here. And they should be boycotted. So I think the BDS is excellent. Talking to people, talking to representatives, making them absolutely understand that they have to stop bowing to AIPAC. Now, the reality in the States is, I can understand American politics. They could care less about Israel and they could care less about Palestine. They want to get elected. Okay? The price of doing business is bowing to AIPAC. Plus, there's a little bit of money and all that involved too. So it's not a big deal. And we support Israel, big deal. And then they can do whatever they need to do, which is why the president does this as well. You can see the look on his face. He's about to throw up every time the name Netanyahu is brought up. But he has to do this because that's what he needs to do to get elected. So he does it. He's got more important issues to deal with. He needs to understand that none of these issues will be accomplished as long as he bows to AIPAC. And what's nice about this is this. I see more and more Jewish activists come to these events and kind of support what I say. And I think it's very important. I think a lot of Americans are afraid to speak up because the claim is, well, you're being anti-Semitic. And the claim is you're hurting the feelings of our Jewish friends. This happens in colleges as well a lot. You're hurting our feelings, these poor Jewish kids, Well, number one, grow up. If it hurts your feelings, it hurts your feelings. I'm sorry, but this is what has to be done. And number two, there are a lot of Jewish activists out there that are doing the same thing. They're out there putting stickers, BDS stickers, boycott stickers on Israeli products. There are Jews, there are Israelis that do this. So I think those are some of the things. And then tell people. Don't be afraid to tell people. Don't be afraid to talk to people, whether they're Jewish, whether they support AIPAC, whether they don't, that there is something going on here that they need to be aware of. And they can help. Not to mention the fact that all these tax dollars, these $3 billion that go in aid officially, and the other $2 billion that go back there in like charity and stuff like that, all these NGOs and 501c3s that send money over there, that's another $2 billion. That could be going to some pretty good use here in America. And so all of this people have to be made aware of this, and I think it has to be said straightforward, without that fear of hurting people's feelings and all that. I think that's really, really important. And the work that activists are doing here is phenomenal. Maybe it needs to be, pushed up just a notch. Okay. The second question was about, the U.S. making money off of war and how would the U.S. react if something like this took place. And it's true that the U.S. is making a lot of money off of this. Half of the aid, half of the $3 billion comes right back here in weapon sales. So this is kind of a way to launder money and support the arms industry. I think a good example, probably one of the best examples of how the American administration responds to things like this is what happened in Egypt. You know, both the State Department and the Israeli Foreign Department worked tirelessly to keep Mubarak in place. They did everything they could to support Mubarak. And when it was suddenly made clear to the Americans that Mubarak is leaving because this revolution is serious, they changed. And they were talking about how important this revolution is and Mubarak's got to go. This is how the American administration will react to things, and that's how it's going to react to this too. I think there's a mistaken, theory that, President Obama in the second term will do something. President Obama in his third and fourth and fifth term won't do anything. He doesn't care enough. He has absolutely no motivation to do anything. Because it would cost, it's politically, it's too expensive. It's not worth it. This is going to happen as a result of the BDS, as a result of pressure from the outside, as a result of the ongoing resistance within Israel, within Palestine, of Palestinians who show up and protest every single week, every Friday and every Saturday. It's going to be a combination of all these things, and it's going to be the weakening support of Jews outside Israel. I see a trend of more and more Jewish people leaving the Zionist community and looking at Israel and saying, this is really not what we want. We don't stand for this. When you started your question, you talked about being brave, and you talked about, I'll tell you who's brave. When I go to a protest, I get arrested, I go home at the end of the day. And it's true for all Israelis. So we inhale some tear gas, maybe we get pushed around a little bit. But we go home at the end of the day, and everybody knows exactly how it's going to end. And then we go back home to, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, wherever we live. Palestinians go home that day. At night, the army is going to raid their house, beat them up, destroy their home, take their kids to prison, beat them up, bring them back the next day, the next month, the next year, nobody knows. But they come back the next week and they protest again. And they come back the following week and they protest again. And they've been doing this for years. They are relentless. They will not stop until this is over. They are brave. And the same goes to the people, the Palestinians who lead the BDS movement. This is a young, new generation of Palestinian leaders who will not stop until it's over. Israel does not know who it's facing. This is a different kind of leadership. The Israeli top brass went into a special convention, a special weekend convention, kind of a think tank, to come up with an answer to the nonviolent protests that have been going on for several years now. They came out, all these brilliant military minds, saying that they have no answer. They have no answer to the nonviolent protests. Now, the good news is that means we're succeeding, and of course the nonviolent protests are continuing. The bad news is that it means they're going to become more and more violent. Palestinians are losing their lives over this. They're being killed. They're being shot. And I fear that's what that means. But the point to remember is that Israel has no answer to this. They don't know how to deal with this. And that's, I think, a very, very important thing. But my point is that they're the brave ones, not people like me. Although I appreciate the compliment. What would it take for Israelis to understand that this is the best thing for them too? That's a very good question. Israelis are raised and go through an education system that is designed to turn them into racists. It's a racist education system. My sister Nurit just came out with a book as well. And what she did was, she looked at the Israeli soldiers and she asked a question. How do these kids that grew up in Israel, which is kind of a liberal society when you're an Israeli Jew, and they learn about freedom of expression and they learn about democracy and so on, they get put in a uniform when they're 18 and they become monsters. How does that happen? So she decided to look at the textbooks. And she analyzed Israeli textbooks in geography, history, civics. I think that's it, those three. And, it took her, I think, 2 years. And the book just came out. And she and I gave a presentation together just about 6 weeks ago. And somebody asked her, when she wrote the book, when she found what she found, what surprised her the most? Or was there something that surprised her more than anything else? And she said the thing that surprised her the most was how systemic the racism is. It's not that there's a story here or a book there that's racist. It's systemic. The racism is systemic. The Israeli textbooks are written in order to teach racism. You know, it's kind of a funny way to say it, but it's textbook racism. There's no mistake here. The way the pictures are laid out, the way the maps are laid out, the way the stories are described, the way massacres are described. They talk about massacres. But at the end of the story of the massacre is a major Israeli leader saying, you know what, it was terrible. But thank goodness, because after the massacre, 200,000 Palestinians fled. And that allowed us to have a majority. So in the end, the massacre was maybe sad, but good thing it happened. Everything within the Israeli education system, the Zionist education system is designed to bring about people who will serve in that army and serve in the bureaucracy and allow the racism to go on. What would it take for them? I don't know what it would take for them, but I think that things like this do not happen as a result of a consensus. You know, apartheid didn't fall because all whites decided that apartheid was wrong. Racism in this country didn't start because all the whites in the South decided to be nice one day. It was forced upon them. There's a small group of people that decided that they were not going to take it anymore, and they fought until they won. You know, Mubarak, I don't know how many, I think there are 80 or 90 million people in Egypt. It only took 1 million in Tahrir Square to get rid of Mubarak. So it's never a consensus. So I don't know if all Israelis will ever be convinced that this is the best thing for them, but it's enough that a few know. Okay, we can do 3 more. You want to do 3 more?
Okay.
Yeah, this is kind of follows the previous question. Looking at the attitudes of Israelis, I think it's an organization, the Israeli Institute for Democracy, that every couple of years puts out opinion polls, surveys of Israelis and Palestinians living in Israel about attitudes. And the last one that I remember looking at, there's typically something like 58% of the Israeli population would say that they would not want to live next door to a Palestinian. And about the same number would advocate that the Palestinians be expelled from Israel. So given that, and what you just said about the textbooks, it seems like it's having an effect of really just turning so much of the population expressing this racist attitude. So how do you see that being challenged?
It seems to me that one of the problems is paranoia among the Jewish population in the United States as well as in Israel. And of course, I think that's not going to go away quickly. It's just going to slowly get better. And I wonder whether it might not be a better idea, but rather than trying to push the solution, it's probably not going to happen for maybe 150 years. Whether we shouldn't try harder to push for human rights throughout Israel-Palestine. I don't think we'll be able to achieve equality, but make our efforts, focus our efforts on promoting human rights throughout the land of Israel-Palestine.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for your incredible, articulate, and beautiful speech. I'm swept away much, because I've been following this for 50 years. Much of this I've known, but it hasn't been so well spelled out. Now I know that they're wonderful. I have gone to the synagogue. I have ecumenically sung in the synagogue, but because I could speak out and possibly have stated a small part of what you have, people get in my face and call me anti-Semitic. So what I do, I just decide to pray for them. In fact, there's a beautiful lady, Maxine, who really got on my case, but won't articulate and tell me what it was that I said. One of the things, and could you speak a moment about the Ethiopian Jews who are descendants of of Solomon. And the last is, do you know of Barbara Lubin and Mecca, which has done such great work to help children along with doctor, and I know both of them.
I spoke at Mecca last night.
Pardon?
I spoke at the event last night. The Mecca event last night.
And incredible. She is over the top. I tell her she certainly tops Mother Teresa.
Would you talk a little bit about the myth of the disengagement from Gaza?
I can talk about Gaza all day. Okay, let's do these three and then go from there. Okay, the attitudes among Israelis. You know, the polls are very funny when it comes to Israelis. You hear all these polls that, 78% of Israelis believe in a two-state solution and want peace. So why do they vote for Netanyahu? Or why do they vote for Lieberman? It's a mystery. I think it's probably more accurate. The polls that you were describing are probably more accurate in terms of describing what Israelis really think. The attitudes of Israelis are afraid and hate Arabs. Palestinians are naturally afraid and don't like Israelis. They're in war. I mean, this is what happens when there's a war going on. Now, the Israelis really believe that there's a war going on, that they're under threat. I think these attitudes will change once there is change. I don't think these attitudes will change until that happens, because unless you cross the other side and you've got faith and trust that the other side is going to, accept you and welcome you, then nobody's going to go. You've got to replace fear with trust. Like I said earlier, I was fortunate enough that I was in a dialogue group, where I was really held by the hand by this wonderful Palestinian community in San Diego, and allowed to replace that fear with trust very gradually. But I put myself in that position, and but I don't think these attitudes will change until people see actually change. The fear is always going to be there, and the hatred is going to be there because they're under war. What I will say is this: I don't know if you guys remember. Well, if you were in Israel during the early stage of Oslo, 93, 94, 95, it was amazing to see how quickly the attitudes changed. Israelis were in the West Bank, eating, shopping, doing all the fun things that you can do in the West Bank. Palestinians were in the malls in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Why fly to London and Paris when it's cheaper to go to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem? The trucks going down to Gaza, which were always old and falling apart, were suddenly new. There was a sense that there was hope. Everybody changed like that. When people say, "Oh, it'll take generations upon generations," I don't think so. Oslo was a very bad agreement. There was a lot of resistance to it, but yet as soon as there was an inkling of hope, boom, attitudes changed right away. So I'm a believer in that. I think that's going to the process again. Yeah, the issue of human rights. The question is this: if you're going to go for human rights, you're going to go for human rights, limited. What I'm talking about is going for human rights. You cannot have a Jewish democracy. You cannot have a Jewish state, a Jewish democracy, when half the population is not Jewish, unless you take away their human rights and their civil rights, because they're going to fight it. Who's not going to fight it? I'm a Palestinian. My parents were, I'm saying, if I was a Palestinian, my parents, I'll give you an example of Palestinian friends of mine, okay? They've lived there for longer than I have. I should say their families have. We were both born there. I come and go as I please. Every time they come and go, they have to go through 5 hours of humiliation and searches like they're criminals. You cannot fight for human rights unless you change the system. Apartheid was keeping the blacks at a different place than the whites. Well, you have to fight that. You have to get rid of apartheid in order to change that. Israel is the same thing. Zionism is the same thing. You're right about the paranoia. But their paranoia is taught. It's not something you're born with. And if you're going to have a Jewish state with Jewish symbols, with a Jewish army, while half the population is not Jewish, then it's not going to work. They're going to fight it and resist it. Now, granted, most of the fighting and resisting is nonviolent, but it's still resistance. So you can have one or the other. You can't have a Jewish state and a democracy. So that's why I say you have to get rid of the notion of a Jewish state. You have to get rid of the Zionist aspect of the state and have a state where equal rights are respected. And the problem with that is that you can't do it in a gradual way, because people don't want to wait, and they have a right to get to have their rights when they want to have their rights. So you either get rid of it's like being pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not. You either respect equal rights or you're not, or you don't. And I think that's the problem with that. You asked me to talk about the Ethiopians, but it's a rather long subject, the Ethiopian Jews. So I don't know if this is, we have the time for this. So with your
Big question: does Israel help the Ethiopians?
No, the situation of the Ethiopian Jews that were brought to Israel is horrific. The racism against them because they're black is unbelievable.
This is what I've heard, but people deny it.
Oh, it's unbelievable. Okay, well maybe I'll spend a minute on it. They were the first thing is they're brought and they're placed in these what they're called absorption centers to be absorbed, and so they're left there for years, without jobs, without resources, without activities for the kids. They look like slums. The only reason there's no crime is because they're such wonderful people, and it's such a benign culture that crime hasn't developed yet. But it's coming. They can't quite be absorbed into society because they are too gentle to be absorbed into this violent, brutal, militant society that Israel is. So from time to time, you see somebody who actually made it in the military. There's one lieutenant colonel I see from time to time in protests, and he's like, they say, look how successful it's been. We've got a lieutenant colonel or a colonel in the Israeli army who's Ethiopian. There's one. They don't talk about all the ones that kill themselves because they can't stand it. And the worst part, I think, of it all is that they were completely given away to the religious, fanatic education system. Israel has got two education systems, one that's secular and one is religious, and they were completely sent off because of coalition and political considerations. So they are shipped away from where they live. They don't go to school area where they live. They are shipped away to schools, often in the settlements, and to yeshivas, often in the settlements, where they're taught that the Arabs came here to take our homes and kill us. And they are being force-fed this education system, the religious education system, which is even far worse than the secular one, which I talked about earlier. So the situation there is absolutely abhorrent. It is a terrible situation. But that is what they do with them. They brought them in, and now they don't quite know what to do with them.
Thank you.
And they're wonderful people. My sister, by the way, just tutors the children because one of the centers is real close to her house. So she kind of tutors them and she develops a relationship. And that's how we know so much about, so why I know about them. You asked about Gaza. What was the question? I just put Gaza, but what was it specifically you said?
For the record, dispel the myth.
Oh, the disengagement. We gave them Gaza and see what they did. We gave them Gaza and see what they did. This is the claim, right? Well, let's talk about that. First of all, we didn't give anybody anything. Sharon wanted to get the settlers out of Gaza, and it was a unilateral thing. He did it by himself, without agreement with anybody else, and with no intention to solve any problem, other than to get those annoying settlers out so he could do more shooting and killing of Palestinians freely. And he also wanted to create this trauma, this national trauma, to see these settlers being yanked out and the soldiers pulling their hair and this whole drama, to create a trauma that would never occur again. So that's what he did. He got the settlers out, but the army didn't take the army out. The Israeli army goes in and out of Gaza very freely. The Israeli security forces go and kill in Gaza very, very freely. And then Gaza is blockaded completely. Completely. All of the economy, as you know, everything that goes in and out of Gaza goes through tunnels. And there's, I think probably the most. Somebody asked me why this morning something about Gaza. Why is Israel so vindictive against Gaza? Well, Gaza has been a sore spot in the life of Israel for from the very beginning, because they have more than half the population are refugees from other part of Palestine, and they resist. And they often try to come in, so they're called infiltrators. And that's why the Sinai campaign of '56 took place as well. There is, they consistently resist and are not willing to take it. So Israel goes in and bombs them and massacres and bombs and kills and bombs and kills. Probably the worst of it was just before President Obama was inaugurated. People like to call it Operation Cast Lead or the Gaza War. It's ridiculous. It was a massacre. 100%. There was nothing about it that was a war, and there was nothing about it that was an operation. On the 27th of December 2008, which I always say will be remembered as the most shameful day in the history of the Jewish people, because that was the day the massacre began. At 11:25 in the morning, when the two school shifts in Gaza has two school shifts, one in the morning one and an afternoon one. Between 11 and 11:30, all the kids are in the street, either going home or going to the second shift. That was the time the attack began. There are 800,000 children in Gaza, and at that moment, the Israeli Air Force began dropping 100 tons of bombs on the first day of a 21-day attack. A 1-ton bomb destroys a city block. A 1-ton bomb will destroy a city block. We're talking about 100 tons of bombs in one of the most densely populated places in the world. On the first day, many hundreds of tons of bombs were dropped over the period of 3 weeks. But that was just the beginning. And somebody asked me today, and I hear this often, the person asked me today, quite innocently, but I often hear this from Israeli supporters, but they warned them. They dropped leaflets warning them that this was coming and that they should leave. Leave to where? Gaza's closed. There's nowhere to go. So in a way, dropping the warnings is even more cruel. Because then you can imagine if you're a parent, you see this flyer, you know that these planes are coming, you know what it's like when the fires start, you know what it's like when the phosphorus hits the skin, you know what it's like when the buildings start crumbling down and you don't know where your children are. So they know this is coming, and they've got nothing to do. They've got nowhere to go. Then the ground troops came in. And I don't know if you saw pictures, but if you've seen them, they're out there. You see the ground troops ready to enter Gaza. Rows and rows and rows of tanks and armored personnel carriers. You'd think this was Patton fighting World War II all over again. What are they going to do in Gaza? There is no army there. The Palestinians have never had a plane, a warplane, or a helicopter, or a warship, or an artillery battery. There's nothing there. What are all these forces going to do in Gaza? Who are they going to fight? There are only civilians there, and 800,000 children. Yet here in America, you may remember this, but every single talking head and every single news anchor was talking about, well, if if Qassam rockets are falling on us, we do the same thing. Not that that makes it okay, but it's complete nonsense. It was a massacre from A to Z. It didn't even stop the Qassam rockets. So the issue of Gaza is I think one of those issues where it's very, very important, and it goes into the next question with the, anti-Semitism and what to do when they call us anti-Semitic and so on. Fine. I'm anti-Semitic? Fine. Now, can you explain dropping 100 tons of bombs on children that have no shelter? Where there's not a single military threat? Zero military threat? Can you explain that? Now let's talk about this. Let's put the anti-Semitic aside for a moment, and let's talk about other issues. And I think Gaza is probably one of the strongest arguments there are, that this is a case of massacres, this is a case of ethnic cleansing, and that this is a brutal regime that has to go.
Books or resources online, etc. I don't know.
Okay, yeah, sure. Okay, well, that's a good way to end it, actually. There's a lot of stuff out there. The things that I like, in terms of online, there's Electronic Intifada, there's Mondowise. These are great sites to go and read things. And I'm just kind of going off the top of my head. In terms of books, we did talk about my book. There's my sister book, it's really an excellent book. It's very enlightening. There's Ilan Pape. Anything he wrote is wonderful. The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, though, is kind of probably I don't know if it's the most important one, but it's most revealing in terms of what happened in 1948 and the connection between what happened in 1948 and what's happening today. Avi Schleim just wrote a book a couple of years ago about Jordan, about King Hussein. It's called The Line of Jordan. It's an excellent book, and it also shows the relationship between Israel and the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and this sick relationship between these two sick entities. One of the great classics is Assad by Patrick Seal. It shows you gives you the whole aspect of what Syria is about during those times. I don't know if there's anything else, Rachel. Do you think of anything? Well, I'm sorry?
Institute for Middle East Understanding.
Yeah. There's a Palestine Center in LA, in DC that puts out things. There's a lot of stuff. I'm sorry? Ali Abu Nima, who does the Electronic Intifada, he's got a book about one state. So those are just things off the top of my head. Charlie Glass, The Tribes Triumphant. Charlie Glass, The Tribes Triumphant. It is an excellent book. I think it's one of the best books ever written about the Middle East. Charlie Glass, The Tribes Triumphant. It's about this big, but it's worth every second. So those are just things that I believe in. Look up all this stuff and read it. It seems like you're a pretty educated crowd here. So go ahead and read more if you like, but spread the word, which I think is important. Okay, thank you all.
Palestinian, I would like to thank you for this comment and this event, really. Let us all, I have no question because you covered it all, and it was from your heart. Your parents, like my parents, the same age, and I am Palestinian. I am one of those people who left Palestine and came here, and I think every word you said so from your heart. With people like you and people like me, we can have hands together and have things no matter what. You did talk about the solution. Because there is nothing between us. We were both Abraham kids. The land for us all. You said enemy. You mentioned enemy. Who is the enemy? The one who came from outside to in, or the one who lived in? You said Palestine. Yes, Jews born in Palestine. This is the holy land for all. Jesus born in land named Palestine. If it is occupied Palestine, no need for war. Occupied Palestine, we can live together. So let's work together and God bless.
Video recording will be shown at some point on Access.
Yes.
We don't know when, but if you follow Access, watch for it. It will be on at some point. Thank you all for coming.